All right, painting students, here we go. Here's our next project. You are to do watercolor painting. We've chosen a landscape for this project as we've done objects now and portraits, and so now we're looking at landscapes, and I'd like you to do a watercolor. So I've provided you some watercolor paints and some watercolor paper. You're welcome to use other watercolor materials if you have better than what I've provided for you at home. So kind of play with what you've got there and see what you can come up with. I do encourage you to practice a little bit first. Watercolors are a little bit different approach than acrylics, and so you find that in order to create a white, you leave the white of the paper to show through, or if you want light colors, you need to leave light areas in order to kind of bring out those light colors. And oftentimes watercolor paintings are a little looser in style, so you kind of have to be, because the water kind of carries the paint a little further. So you've got some choices to work with watercolors. Sometimes it can be very wet, and sometimes you can kind of control it with a little bit less water. All right, so here we are. So I've given you some, I believe it's a hot press color paper. It's for some of you, you don't prefer this type. This is the first time I actually purchased this type, and so work with what you have there. In future I might choose a different type of watercolor paper, but this one works pretty well with what we're looking at. There are other types of watercolor paper. Cold press has a little bit more texture to it, and then there's some that are a little more pronounced. If you like to kind of create a little texture in your watercolors, there are other types, like a rough textured paper. All right, so watercolor brushes, I pretty much just threw in what you had there. So if you have something else, a soft brush works probably the best. So if you need to clean out that acrylic brush really well in order to kind of brush and be smooth in its application. It holds water as well. There are different techniques that you can use. Basically, when watercolor is still wet, it bleeds quite a bit, and that may be a technique that you do want, versus working on a dry surface with wet paint. You can kind of practice this a little bit as you are playing with the materials before actually diving into your landscape picture. There are washes, so you can kind of go from light to dark, like with this graduated blend. If you have a sky and you have a kind of a deep color to begin with and you want it to fade just a little bit, you can also join and blend colors with the water, so you can blend from the red into the yellow and create an orange. And then there's also just like a flat wash where you're just covering an area with a solid color. I didn't provide you with any masking fluid, but you can use different materials to kind of create a mask, like crayons. You can't remove it like Misket can. So previously, last semester, we had some Frisket or Misket to use to block out some areas. So that's not something that'll be at your disposal, but there are other options like rubber cement you can use to mask out an area, and then you watercolor over it, and then you remove the mask to kind of create some more sharp edges. I provided this worksheet, and I will put it in Classroom. It's just some general ways of using watercolor. You can use dry brush. Basically, you're just like it sounds. You've got wet paint on a dry brush. It kind of gives it a scrumbly technique. You can sprinkle salt right on to watercolor while it's wet, and it will separate and kind of create that mottled look. Crayon will resist, so you could pencil out or find a white crayon and kind of create just like you do when you use dye Easter eggs. You use a crayon to kind of resist the watercolor and kind of has some interesting effects. You can use masking tape. Just be very careful that it's painter's tape, and then apply it so it's not tacked down too harshly so that it pulls up your paper. So play with some different techniques here. This was a worksheet that we kind of played with some different methods with. before we began our projects. All right, so I have a couple of videos on how to paint watercolors, as well as this one here, avoiding overworking, just some good techniques and tips from a watercolor specialist. I put these separate. I put them in the slideshow, as well as I separated them out so you can find them easily in Classroom. Here are some student examples from first semester. Naomi Zarate's, she incorporated some pen and ink, and you're surely welcome to do that, as well as you could incorporate other materials like watercolor pencils or colored pencils. You could kind of lay over the watercolor to kind of add some more details. Here are some more examples from first semester. So I will let you get to it, and good luck painting.